In today's video, you'll hear the story of a man who wakes up to a perfect life he can't remember, only to discover that his new reality might be an elaborate prison for his mind. The story begins with the slow, disorienting return of consciousness. Andrew Mitchell's first sensation was not of pain, but of a profound and unnatural stillness, the kind of silence that presses in from all sides, heavy and absolute. He felt the plush weight of a thick quilt over him, the scent of pine and old wood filling his nostrils, clean and crisp. A fire crackled somewhere nearby, a gentle rhythmic sound that should have been comforting, but instead felt like a carefully placed metronome, counting down to something unknown. His eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the dim, warm light of a room that was both luxurious and rustic. Heavy wooden beams crossed the high ceiling, and through a large window, he could see a world buried in white. Snow fell in thick, silent flakes, thus obscuring the horizon and swallowing the landscape, creating a sense of perfect, beautiful isolation. He was safe. The thought arrived in his mind not as a conclusion, but as a suggestion, planted there by the serene environment. He sat up slowly, his body feeling strangely distant, an instrument he was only just learning to control. There were no aches, no sharp reminders of an injury, yet a deep, internal weariness clung to his bones. His gaze swept the room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, the flames within dancing lazily. An antique bookshelf stood against another, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked untouched. Everything was perfect, too perfect, like a stage meticulously set for a play whose script he did not know. It was then that he saw her. A woman sat in a high-backed armchair by the fire, her silhouette framed by the gentle orange glow. She turned her head and a smile graced her lips, a smile of such warmth and familiarity that it almost convinced him. Her brown hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her eyes held a look of patient adoration. She was beautiful, and the sight of her sparked a flicker of something in the void of his mind, a phantom limb of a memory. He knew he was supposed to know her. The woman, Laura, rose and moved toward the bed with a fluid grace. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft, melodic, a sound designed to soothe. She explained the situation with a practiced calm, her words weaving a narrative that was both terrifying and reassuring. "A car accident," she said, "a patch of black ice on a winding mountain road. He had been lucky," she murmured, her hand gently touching his arm. The contact was warm, yet it sent a dissonant hum through his nerves. His memory was gone, she explained. A temporary condition, the doctors had assured her. He just needed to rest, to let the pieces fall back into place on their own. She was his wife. This was their cabin, a secluded getaway they had built together. This was their life. Andrew listened, absorbing the information like a dry sponge. It made sense. Amnesia. It explained the blank slate of his mind, the absence of a past. He looked at her, at Laura, his supposed wife, and tried to feel the connection, the years of shared history she spoke of. He found nothing, only a hollow echo where love should have been. Yet he nodded, accepting the reality she presented. It was easier than confronting the terrifying emptiness. The days that followed blurred into a routine of tranquil domesticity. Laura was the perfect caretaker, attentive and loving. She cooked gourmet meals, read to him by the fire, and spoke of their shared memories, painting a picture of a life filled with joy and adventure. She described their travels to exotic places, their favorite songs, the day they met. Each story was a beautiful, polished gem, but to Andrew they felt like borrowed anecdotes, tales of a stranger's life. He played his part, smiling, nodding, asking the right questions. He wanted to believe. The alternative, That he was a man without a past, adrift in an unfamiliar world, was too horrifying to contemplate, yet small cracks began to appear in the flawless facade of his new life. It started with the sound, a low, muffled thumping from somewhere deep within the walls of the cabin. It was faint, easy to dismiss as the house settling or the wind rattling a loose board, but it was rhythmic, persistent, a dull heartbeat in the bones of the structure. When he mentioned it to Laura, she would simply smile her serene smile and say she heard nothing, attributing it to his mind playing tricks on him, a common side effect of his trauma. She would change the subject, her voice a little too bright, a little too quick to steer him away from the unsettling noise. Then came the distortions in the mirror, while shaving one morning, staring at the face of a man who was supposed to be him, a man of 45, with tired blue eyes and graying temples. The reflection flickered. For a split second, the image wavered, the lines of his face shifting into a grotesque mask of scars and agony, his eyes wide with a silent scream. He recoiled, dropping the razor, which clattered against the porcelain sink. When he looked again, his reflection was normal, the calm, unfamiliar face staring back at him as if nothing had happened. He splashed cold water on his face, his heart pounding against his ribs. It was a hallucination, a product of his injured brain. That had to be the explanation, but the image was seared into his mind, a visceral, terrifying glimpse of a past he couldn't access. The man in the mirror had looked haunted. He had looked like he was in pain, a deep, soul-crushing pain that the placid man he saw now could not comprehend. He didn't mention this to Laura. A part of him, an instinct he didn't know he possessed, warned him not to. It was the first secret he kept in this new, shared life, a small seed of distrust planted in the fertile ground of his uncertainty. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt different. The silence between the floorboards seemed to hold its breath. The shadows in the corners of the rooms seemed to lengthen and deepen when he wasn't looking directly at them. The beautiful isolation of the snow-covered landscape began to feel less like a peaceful retreat and more like a pristine, inescapable cage. Andrew began to study the house with a quiet intensity, his senses sharpened by a primal fear he was only beginning to acknowledge. The cabin was a masterpiece of architecture, a seamless blend of natural materials and modern comfort. Every joint in the woodwork was perfect, every stone in the fireplace precisely placed. It was a home built with obsessive care, yet it felt cold, devoid of the warmth of shared history. It lacked the small imperfections that accumulate over years of life, the nicks in the door frames, the faint stains on the floor, the subtle signs of two people existing in a space together. It was a showroom, not a home. He started testing Laura, asking for specific details about their past. He asked about the first gift he ever gave her, the name of her childhood pet, the scar above her left eyebrow which he had only just noticed. Her answers were always immediate, detailed, and flawless. She spoke with a wistful smile, her eyes sparkling with the light of cherished memories. But her perfection was its own kind of flaw. There was no hesitation, no moment of searching her mind for a half-forgotten detail. Her recollections were too clean, like lines recited from a script. One evening, as she described a trip they supposedly took to Florence, she mentioned a small cafe where they spent hours drinking coffee and watching the world go by. She described the red and white, checkered tablecloths, the taste of the biscotti, the specific shade of the sunset over the Arno. It was a beautiful, vivid memory. The next day, while idly flipping through one of the leather-bound books from the shelf, a postcard fell out. It was from Florence. It depicted the Ponte Vecchio, and on the back, a short message was scrawled in unfamiliar handwriting. It mentioned a wonderful trip, but lamented a terrible case of food poisoning from a cafe with blue tablecloths. The signature was illegible, but the discrepancy was a jolt to Andrew's system. Blue tablecloths, not red and white. It was a small thing, insignificant, a simple mistake. But in the fragile ecosystem of his constructed reality, it was a tremor that signaled an impending earthquake. He quickly hid the postcard, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. It was proof. His intuition wasn't a symptom of his trauma. It was a warning. The rhythmic thumping in the walls grew more insistent, no longer just a background noise, but a deliberate, beckoning call. It seemed to move, sometimes coming from the floor beneath his feet, other times from the ceiling above. He would press his ear against the cold wood, trying to pinpoint its source, the vibrations humming through his skull. He started to explore the cabin whenever Laura was occupied, her serene presence now a source of suffocating anxiety. He checked every closet, tapped on every wall, searched for a loose floorboard or a hidden panel. He found nothing. The house was a fortress, impeccably constructed, with no apparent secrets. But the sound persisted, a patient, maddening pulse that seemed to mock his efforts. It was the sound of something waiting. It knew he was listening. This certainty settled deep in his gut, cold and heavy. The sound wasn't random. It was communication. His nights became a landscape of dread. He would lie awake in the comfortable bed, the silence of the snow-filled world outside, a stark contrast to the turmoil in his mind. He watched the steady, peaceful rhythm of Laura's breathing as she slept beside him, her face a mask of tranquility. He wondered what lay behind that perfect face, what kind of consciousness animated that beautiful, placid form. He began to fear sleep, terrified of the dreams that might be waiting for him in the dark, dreams that might show him the truth he was not yet ready to face. The distorted reflection in the mirror had been a glimpse into his own forgotten pain. But what if there was something else? What if the cabin held other reflections, other truths? One night, unable to bear the suffocating stillness of the bedroom, he padded silently into the main living area. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows that writhed like living things. He stood before the large picture window, the pane a sheet of black glass, reflecting the dimly lit room. He saw his own silhouette, a dark shape against the faint orange glow of the embers. And for a horrifying, stomach-churning moment, he was not alone in the reflection. Standing just behind his shoulder, where only empty space should have been, was a figure. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its form indistinct, a smudge of deeper darkness against the shadows. It had no face, only a smooth blank surface where features should have been. It wasn't the scarred man from the mirror. It was something else entirely, something other. It raised a long, spindly arm and placed a hand on his reflected shoulder. Andrew felt nothing, no physical touch, but a wave of nauseating cold washed over him, a violation so profound it felt like an icy hand closing around his soul. He spun around, his breath catching in his throat. The room was empty. There was nothing there, just the dying fire, the antique furniture, and the oppressive, waiting silence. He looked back at the window, his body trembling uncontrollably. His reflection was alone again, but the feeling of that cold, possessive touch lingered, an phantom brand on his very being. He now knew, with a certainty that transcended logic or proof, that the house was watching him, and it was not alone. The thumping in the walls sounded again, closer this time, a slow, deliberate beat that seemed to say, "I see you." He understood then that his search for the truth was no longer about recovering his past. It was about survival. The idyllic cabin was not a place of healing. It was a hunting ground. Laura, with her perfect smile and recited memories, was the bait, and he was the prey, caught in a trap so elegant and insidious that he hadn't even realized he was caught until the jaws had already begun to close. His amnesia wasn't a wound that needed to be healed. It was a weapon being used against him, keeping him docile and confused. The muffled sound was a clue. The distorted reflections were cracks in the illusion. The postcard was a mistake from his captor. A cold, sharp clarity cut through the fog of his confusion. He had to remember, not just for himself, but because some deep, buried part of him knew that remembering was the only way to fight back. His life, his real life, was a key, and he had to find it before the entity in the house consumed him completely, leaving nothing behind but an empty shell with a serene, vacant smile. The memories Laura had given him were a cage, and he had to find the ones that would set him free, even if they were memories of pain and tragedy. The scarred man in the mirror was not a hallucination. He was a signpost, pointing the way back to who he truly was. Andrew's demeanor shifted. On the surface, he remained the pliant, grateful amnesiac. He smiled at Laura, complimented her cooking, and listened to her stories with feigned interest. But beneath that placid exterior, a cold, calculating mind was at work. He was an actor now, and his life depended on the performance. Every moment became an exercise in gathering intelligence. He paid attention to the way the floorboards creaked differently in certain parts of the house, the way the light from the windows never seemed to change regardless of the time of day, a perpetual overcast grayness that was as uniform as it was unnerving. The snow outside never stopped falling, yet the level of the drifts against the windows never rose. It was a perfect, looping animation of a winter day, designed to contain and pacify. He started to understand that the entity controlling the house was powerful, but perhaps not omniscient. It made mistakes. The postcard was one. The unchanging weather was another. It was working from a template, a limited understanding of how a perfect life should look and feel, and its creation, while beautiful, was fundamentally sterile. His greatest challenge was managing his own reactions. The fear was a constant icy presence in his veins, and with it came a rising tide of anger. It was a cold, pure rage directed at the thing that had stolen his life and replaced it with this hollow counterfeit. There were moments when he would look at Laura, at the serene, empty beauty of her face, and feel an almost uncontrollable urge to lash out, to shatter the illusion, and demand the truth. During one dinner, as she recounted a story about a beach vacation, her description of the ocean was so technically perfect, yet so emotionally vacant, that something inside him snapped. He felt a growl rising in his throat, his hand clenching the silver fork so tightly his knuckles turned white, the metal bending under the pressure. Her voice faltered for a fraction of a second, her placid smile tightening at the edges. Her eyes, for the briefest of moments, lost their warm, loving look and became flat, dark pools of ancient alien intelligence. It was a look of assessment, of a biologist observing a specimen that was behaving unexpectedly. The moment passed as quickly as it came. Andrew forced his hand to relax, placed the bent fork carefully on the table, and manufactured a cough to cover his lapse. He apologized, blaming a sudden headache. Laura's smile returned, all warmth and concern once more. But he knew she had seen. The entity knew he was beginning to resist. That night, he decided he could no longer wait for the truth to reveal itself, and in fragments, he had to force the issue. Lying in the dark, with the sound of Laura's placid breathing filling the silence, he closed his eyes and pushed past the fear. He focused his mind, not on the pleasant, fabricated memories Laura had gifted him, but on the single, visceral image of his own creation, the scarred, tormented face in the mirror. He pictured the agony in those eyes, the silent scream on those lips. He embraced the pain, welcomed it, because he knew it was real. It was his. He called out to it in the silent space of his own mind, demanding to know its name, demanding to know its story. He pushed deeper and deeper into that single, terrifying frame of memory, trying to pry it open. The reaction was immediate and violent. The house, which had been a passive observer, awoke with furious energy. The muffled thumping within the walls exploded into a deafening, chaotic roar, 1,000 fists hammering against the inside of a wooden coffin. The entire cabin began to shake, the floor vibrating with a low, gut-wrenching frequency. The temperature plummeted, the cozy warmth of the room vanishing in an instant, replaced by a tomb-like cold that raised goosebumps on his skin and made his breath plume in the air. Laura, beside him, did not stir. She remained perfectly still, her breathing even, a serene statue in the heart of a hurricane. Andrew knew then that she was not just the entity's puppet, she was its anchor, the calm, unassailable core of the illusion. The roaring intensified, the sound of splintering wood and grinding stone filling the air, and through it all, a new sound emerged, a high-pitched, whispering hiss that seemed to come from all directions at once, slithering into his ears and coiling around his thoughts. It was a voice of pure malice, speaking in a language of static and dread, and it was telling him to stop, to forget, to obey. But Andrew held on, his mind locked on the image of the scarred man, his only piece of truth in a world of lies. He opened his eyes. The room was shaking violently now, books tumbling from the shelves, the stone fireplace cracking. But it was the window that held his attention. The glass, which had shown only the placid, never-ending snowfall, was now a swirling vortex of blackness. The serene winter landscape was gone, torn away like a cheap backdrop, revealing a horrifying, empty void behind it. And from that void, something was looking back. He couldn't see it, but he could feel its gaze, a pressure against his mind, immense and ancient and ravenous. The house was not just a trap, it was a mouth, and it was preparing to swallow him whole. The last thing he saw before the roaring sound overwhelmed his senses was the faint, ghostly image of his own terrified face reflected in the black void of the window, and behind him, a dark, spindly hand was reaching out from the shadows of the room. It was then he realized the muffled sound from behind the walls was not a sound at all. It was a memory, his own, screaming to be heard. The silent scream of his own memory was a sound only Andrew could hear, a phantom echo trapped behind the ornate wallpaper and meticulously crafted wooden walls of the cabin. The sound was no longer a dull, rhythmic thumping. It was a chaotic, desperate clamor, a soul struggling to break free from a tomb of illusion. He now understood the purpose of the noise. It was him, a real part of him, an echo of his past, and a warning for his present. It was the last vestige of his identity, fighting against the polished lie that had been constructed around him. The entity's violent reaction to his attempt to remember was the proof he needed. He was not just a passive victim. He was a participant in a battle for his own mind. The realization filled him with a cold, righteous resolve. He no longer needed to pretend. He no longer needed to play along. His fear was replaced by a grim determination. The house seemed to perceive this shift. The pleasant, fabricated atmosphere began to fray at the edges. The tranquil silence of the snowfall outside was replaced by the low, insistent moan of a frigid wind that seemed to mourn his awakening. The shadows in the corners of the rooms no longer simply lurked. They writhed, deepening into impossible pools of darkness that seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of their own. Laura's perfect smile became a static, unsettling mask. She no longer spoke of shared memories with the same lyrical ease. Instead, her sentences were shorter, her gaze a little too fixed, as if she were waiting for him to make a move. Her movements, once so fluid, were now stilted and precise, like a machine trying to emulate grace. He noticed that she never left the house, not even to fetch more firewood. The outside world was a thing of the past for her, a place she spoke of but never ventured into. She was a perfect doll, trapped in a perfect dollhouse. The muffled noise from within the walls became his guide. It led him on a silent scavenger hunt through the cabin. He would wait for Laura to be occupied, sitting by the fire with one of her pristine books, and then he would follow the sound. He crept through the long hallways, his feet silent on the thick rugs, his ears straining against the low murmur of the wind. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a confusing chorus of despair. He ran his hands along the walls, searching for a seam, a loose panel, any sign of a hidden compartment. The woodwork was flawless, the surface smooth and unyielding. The silence was his enemy, the way it swallowed every small sound he made, amplifying his paranoia. The silence of the cabin was a lie, a fabricated absence of noise meant to unnerve him and prevent him from hearing the truth. One afternoon, a sudden piercing noise from within the walls echoed through the house, a high-pitched shriek of protest that was unlike the muffled thumping. It was a sound of agony, a moment of pure, raw terror that sent a jolt of recognition through Andrew's spine. It sounded like a memory being torn apart. The sound seemed to originate from the area behind the immense bookshelf in the living room. Andrew looked at Laura, whose head was bowed over a book. He waited, his muscles coiled, ready to spring. She did not react. She did not even flinch. He walked slowly toward the bookshelf, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The scent of old paper and dust, a genuine organic smell that was out of place in this sterilized house, grew stronger as he approached. He began to tap on the wall behind the books, a systematic process of deduction. A different sound, a hollow thud, answered his taps in a small section behind a row of thick, leather-bound encyclopedias. He pushed on the books, but they were unmovable, bolted to the shelf. He ran his fingers along the edge of the shelf itself, searching for a lever or a catch. His hand brushed against a small, ornate carving on the side of the bookshelf. It was a half moon, and it was slightly ajar. He pushed it, and with a soft, almost imperceptible click, a section of the bookshelf slid inward, revealing a dark, narrow passage. A rush of cold, stagnant air, smelling of earth and something ancient and rotten, flooded the room, a stark contrast to the clean, sterile scent he had grown so accustomed to. The passageway was small, barely wide enough for him to squeeze through. He glanced back at Laura, who remained immobile, her focus fixed on the unread pages of her book. The flicker of that cold, inhuman intelligence was a fleeting glimpse in her eyes, a sign that she knew exactly what he was doing. She was letting him go, or rather, she was guiding him. He felt a moment of profound dread, the sensation that he was walking into a trap, but the need for answers was a hunger that had long since overtaken his fear. He moved into the darkness, the bookshelf sliding back into place behind him with a silent click. The air was heavy and thick, and a suffocating darkness pressed in on all sides. His hands felt along the rough, uneven surface of the walls, a stark contrast to the smooth, polished wood of the main cabin. It was real. This part of the house was not an illusion. The passageway led to a small, hidden room, a cramped space devoid of light. He fumbled in the dark, his fingers brushing against a cold, smooth surface. He found a small box on a shelf, its hinges stiff with rust. He opened it. his fingers fumbling with a lock that gave way with a final, echoing groan. Inside the box, bathed in the faint light filtering through a crack in the wall, was a journal. It was old, the pages yellowed and brittle with age, the cover worn and faded. Beside it were a stack of photos, held together by a fraying rubber band. He picked up the photos first, his hands shaking. The first one was of a woman with curly red hair and a warm, vibrant smile, her eyes sparkling with life. A woman he did not know, yet her face was more familiar to him than his own. He knew her name instinctively, Mary, his real wife. His heart ached with a sudden violent pain, a torrent of emotion so powerful it brought him to his knees. The memories hit him not as a gentle wave, but as a hurricane. He saw her face, her smile, heard her laughter, felt the warmth of her hand in his. He saw another man, a tall, robust figure with a welcoming smile. David Harrison, his best friend. The photos showed them together, laughing, living, their faces etched with the genuine, imperfect joy of a life truly lived. He saw a third man, with dark hair and a beard, Chris Jones, his closest friend, his face forever frozen in a moment of easy laughter. This was the life he had lost. This was his real past. The truth was not a hallucination. It was a ghost, haunting the sterile halls of his false existence. He opened the journal. The handwriting was a familiar scrawl, his own. The first entry was dated months ago. It spoke of a new, unsettling feeling, a pervasive paranoia, the sensation of being watched. He had been on a business trip, far away from home, when it began. The journal entries grew more frantic, detailing the subtle shifts in reality, the distorted reflections in mirrors, the whispers in empty hotel rooms. The narrative was a mirror of his current experience, but from a perspective of sanity and self-awareness. The last entry spoke of a sense of approaching doom, a premonition that something was about to happen, that he was being hunted. It ended with a frantic scrawl, the words almost illegible. The house, it knows, it wants me. It's not just a house. The journal fell from his trembling fingers, landing with a soft thud on the floor. Andrew looked at the photograph of Mary in his hands, her smile, a beacon of a life he had forgotten, a life the entity had stolen from him. He moved silently back through the passage, the roar of the house's protest now a low, rumbling growl. He came out into the main living room, the bookshelf silently closing behind him. Laura stood in the middle of the room, her back to him, her head still bowed. She had been waiting. Her posture was unnaturally rigid, a statue in the center of the storm. He held up the photograph of Mary. His voice, when he spoke, was a strained whisper, filled with a cold, pure fury he hadn't known he possessed. The first words he had spoken that were not an act, not a lie. The sound shattered the oppressive silence, a sound of truth in a place of deceit. Laura slowly turned around, her face still wearing that perfect, serene smile. But there was a look in her eyes now, a fleeting moment of cold, non-human calculation, a momentary crack in the mask that revealed the terrifying reality underneath. She was not a person. She was a vessel. She took a step toward him, her movements smooth and silent, a predator closing in on its prey. Andrew stood his ground, the photograph of Mary a fragile shield against the encroaching dread. The warmth of the image, the captured light of a real, lived moment, was a stark contrast to the cold, artificial perfection of the room. He watched as Laura's smile, the cornerstone of the entire illusion, began to dissolve. It did not fade naturally. It fractured, like a porcelain mask cracking under pressure. The corners of her mouth twitched, the skin around her eyes tightening, revealing the mechanical process behind the expression. The change was subtle, but to Andrew's newly awakened senses, it was as dramatic as a seismic shift. The entity was recalibrating, its carefully constructed persona failing in the face of an unexpected variable. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with a palpable tension that made it difficult to breathe. The fire in the hearth dwindled, its cheerful crackle replaced by a low, mournful hiss as the flames shrank away from the cold that was now emanating from the woman in the center of the room. Her response was not one of anger or denial. It was something far more unnerving. She tilted her head, a slow, curious gesture, like a bird of prey studying an unfamiliar creature. Her eyes, now devoid of any pretense of human warmth, scanned the photograph in his hand, then moved to his face. There was a flicker of something in their dark depths, not recognition, but a kind of detached analysis. The entity was processing the information, cross-referencing this piece of his true past with the fiction it had so carefully woven. When she finally moved, it was with a chilling, deliberate slowness. She took another step closer, her feet making no sound on the wooden floor. She was a phantom in her own home. She did not try to take the photograph from him. Instead, she began to weave a new layer of deceit, her voice maintaining its soft, melodic quality, a beautiful sound delivering a venomous lie. She explained that the items he found were a tragic side effect of his trauma. The mind, she purred, was a fragile thing, and in its attempt to heal, it sometimes created narratives, latching onto fragments of dreams or fantasies to fill the void of memory. The woman in the picture, Mary, was a figment, a symbol of a life his broken mind wished it had. The journal was his own writing, yes, but it was the product of a delusional state before the healing could begin. The words were a calculated assault on his sanity, designed to make him question the one piece of solid ground he had found. For a moment, a sliver of doubt pierced his resolve. What if she was right? What if he was truly losing his mind? And this beautiful, serene prison was a kindness, a sanctuary from his own internal chaos. He looked from Laura's earnest, concerned face to the vibrant, laughing face of Mary in the photograph. He felt the phantom warmth of Mary's hand, the echo of her laughter, the profound, gut-level certainty of their shared existence. And then he looked into Laura's eyes and saw the void behind them. He saw the cold, alien intelligence that wore her face like a costume. The doubt vanished, replaced by a surge of defiant certainty. He knew, with every fiber of his being, that Mary was real. His past was real. The entity was lying. He shook his head slowly, a single, silent gesture of refusal that carried more weight than any shout. He would not be gaslit. He would not surrender his memory again. His defiance seemed to amuse the entity. The last vestiges of Laura's human persona fell away. The fabricated warmth was gone, replaced by an unnerving, absolute calm. This was the entity's true face, a being of immense power and patience, a predator that had all the time in the world. It was done with the pretense of love and care. The rules of the game had changed. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted from psychological thriller to overt horror. The shadows in the room deepened, coalescing into solid shapes that seemed to reach for him with long, tenebrous fingers. The wind outside howled like a banshee, rattling the window panes with a furious percussive force. A fine layer of frost began to creep across the inside of the glass. The intricate, feathery patterns, a beautiful harbinger of a deadly cold. Andrew could feel the house focusing its will upon him, a crushing weight of malevolent energy designed to break his spirit. Yet he held on, the image of Mary his anchor in the storm. Then the entity, through Laura's placid lips, delivered its most potent poison. She explained, her voice now a flat, emotionless monotone, that the illusion was not a prison, but a protection. Everything she had told him, every fabricated memory, every comforting lie, was for his own safety. The statement hung in the frigid air, a paradox wrapped in a threat. Safety from what? Safety from the pain of the accident? He looked down at the photo of Chris Jones, his friend, and a sudden jagged memory of twisting metal and shattering glass tore through his mind. The pain of that memory was real, but it was his pain, a part of his story. It was better than the numb, hollow peace of this place. He met Laura's gaze, his own eyes burning with the question. She saw it, and a thin, cruel smile touched her lips, the first genuine expression he had seen on her face. It was a smile of absolute superiority. The world he came from, she stated calmly, the life with Mary and David and Chris, was not the idyllic existence he imagined. There was a reason the house had found him. It did not choose its residents at random. It chose the ones who were already lost, the ones whose reality had already become a source of unbearable pain. The accident, she implied, was not the beginning of his horror. It was an escape. The implication was monstrous. It suggested that the life he was fighting to remember was a nightmare, and this gilded cage was a paradise in comparison. The house was not a predator that had stolen him from a happy life. It was a scavenger, feeding on the wreckage of a life already destroyed. The thought was a venomous seed, planting itself in the deepest part of his mind. Could it be true? What could be worse than this? What kind of life would make this beautiful, soulless prison a preferable alternative? He clutched the photos and the journal, his weapons, which now felt like they could be instruments of his own damnation. He had fought to reclaim his past, only to be told that his past was the real monster. The entity had him trapped in a new, more sophisticated prison, a prison of the mind where the very truth he sought was presented as the ultimate threat. He was lost again, but this time he was not adrift in a sea of amnesia, but in a horrifying ocean of doubt. Laura's eyes, however, betrayed a fleeting moment of cold, non-human calculation, as she calmly stated that everything she told him was for his own protection. The cold, cruel suggestion that his true life was a horror worse than this prison was a psychological blow far more effective than any physical attack. Andrew Mitchell stood frozen in the center of the cabin, clutching the photographs and the journal, the radiant smile of Mary Clark in his hands. A stark and beautiful lie. If his past was a lie, then what was real? Was he a monster from his own history, running from a deserved fate? The seed of doubt, planted with such precision by the entity wearing Laura's face, began to take root in his mind, its icy tendrils coiling around his fragile resolve. The house, sensing his faltering grip on reality, responded with a low, triumphant hum that vibrated through the floorboards and up into his bones. The serene smile had returned to Laura's face, but it was no longer an invitation to peace. It was a promise of his inevitable surrender. It was the smile of a hunter watching its prey falter and give up. But something within Andrew resisted. The feel of the paper under his fingers, the tangible presence of the photos and the worn journal were his anchors. They were real. He looked at the face of David Harrison, his best friend, and a fragment of a memory of a shared joke and a long-ago fishing trip surfaced from the depths of his mind. The feeling of that moment was genuine, a warm, reassuring sensation of camaraderie. That feeling was not something that could be manufactured by an entity. It was an imperfect, human thing, born of shared experience. The entity had lied. Its power was not to create, but to manipulate, to twist and corrupt a stolen reality. His past was not the monster. The house was. With that renewed sense of clarity, Andrew's paralysis shattered. He had to escape. The battle for his mind could not be won while he remained within the belly of the beast. He ran for the front door, the heavy oak slab a final barrier between him and the outside world. The doorknob was cold, an almost electric shock to his touch. but it turned easily. He pulled the door open, the sound of the latch a loud, echoing crack in the oppressive silence. The sight that greeted him should have been a relief, but it was only a new kind of horror. The gentle, silent snowfall was gone. The world outside the cabin was a desolate, monochromatic expanse of blinding white. The sky was a pale, sickly gray, and the air that rushed in was a frigid, searing gale that stole his breath. The trees that had once ringed the cabin in a protective embrace were now twisted, blackened silhouettes, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. The path he had used to arrive was no longer a path, but a jagged scar of broken ice and fractured earth that led to a cliff edge that had not been there before. He stood on the threshold, staring out at the impossible landscape, his mind reeling. The world was not static. It was alive. It was a projection of the house's will, a nightmare made manifest. He looked down at his feet and saw that the snow on the porch was swirling, not with the wind, but in a tight counterclockwise spiral, as if trying to pull him back inside. The air itself seemed to resist his every motion. He turned and saw Laura standing behind him, still by the fire, her head tilted, her gaze calm and absolute. She hadn't moved. The house was doing this on its own. Andrew slammed the door shut, the sound of its closure a finality that echoed in the silent, waiting cabin. The isolation was no longer just a physical state, but a spiritual one. He was trapped, but his resolve was now an unshakable thing. He would not surrender. He would find another way. He moved to the back of the house, looking out a large window that overlooked what had been a frozen lake. It was no longer there. In its place was an endless, churning expanse of dark, viscous mud, a sucking morass that stretched to the horizon. The scent of rot and decay that had been in the hidden passage was now everywhere, a nauseating stench that clung to the cold air. The house was alive, and it was twisting the world to its own will. It was not a building. It was a sentient organism. Laura was not its mistress, but a manifestation of its conscious will. This understanding, once a terrifying guess, was now a cold, undeniable fact. He heard a low, scraping sound from the front door and turned, his heart hammering in his chest. A dark, misshapen shadow was trying to force its way in, a silent, struggling form against the glass of the window. It was human-like, but its limbs were too long, its movements too jerky, as if a body was being puppeted by a force that did not understand human anatomy. It was a ghastly reflection of the tortured figure he had seen in the mirror. Then, the shadow solidified. It was his friend, David Harrison. But it was not David. The face was his, but it was contorted in a silent scream, the eyes wide with abject horror. The body was a parody of David's strong, robust form, thin and emaciated, its bones jutting out against a papery thin skin. It was an image of pure, unbearable agony. The figure pressed its face against the glass, its lips moving, but no sound came out. Andrew felt a surge of nauseating hope. Was it a vision? Was it real? Was David somehow here, trying to save him? A desperate, silent plea radiated from the figure, a wave of palpable despair that resonated with the scream from his own memory. But then the illusion fractured. The face of David, with its contorted scream, wavered, replaced by the serene, smiling face of Laura. It was a momentary shift, a glitch in the house's programming. The figure at the door was not David. It was an image of David, a cruel and clever trick designed to break his spirit. The house was not just twisting the outside world. It was twisting his memories, weaponizing the love he felt for his friends against him. The thought was a sickening, brutal realization. He recoiled from the window, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The vision of David's agony was a mockery, a perversion of his friend's memory. It was the entity taunting him with the image of his loved ones suffering. It was a confirmation that his real life was a source of nourishment for this creature, a buffet of human emotion and memory for it to feed upon. He looked over at Laura, who had not moved, and the serene smile on her face seemed to widen imperceptibly, a silent triumph. He understood now. The house and its mistress were not separate. Laura was an extension of the house itself, a projection of its will. She was the smiling face of the monster that had trapped him. The full horror of his situation washed over him. He was alone, not just physically, but spiritually. His memories, the very essence of who he was, were being used against him. The house was a living, breathing thing, an impossible, non-Euclidean space that could bend reality to its will. Its purpose was simple and monstrous: to lure lonely people, to absorb their memories, and to feed on them until there was nothing left but an empty shell. He looked around the room, at the perfect, unblemished furniture, the untouched books, the perpetually glowing embers of the fire. It was a beautiful stomach, digesting him slowly, piece by piece. The muffled sound from behind the walls of his memory was the sound of its previous victims, their last desperate cries echoing in the emptiness, their souls consumed, their identities reduced to a food source for a parasitic entity. He had to get out, not just to escape the physical space, but to escape the mental prison. He needed a weapon, a weakness, anything that could break the illusion. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning for something, anything that felt out of place. His gaze fell upon the stone fireplace. It was perfect, flawless, as if built in a single moment. But it was a part of the house, a part of the illusion. He needed to break it. He needed to find the one thing that the entity couldn't replicate or control: his own reflection. With a final, desperate burst of strength, he picked up a heavy cast-iron poker from beside the fireplace, its weight a solid, comforting reality in his trembling hands. He walked toward the large window, the source of so much of his horror. The image of David's contorted face was still seared into his mind, the entity's taunt a constant nauseating presence. He raised the poker, and with a single, furious swing, he shattered the glass. The sound of the breaking pane was not a loud, sharp crack, but a low, wet tearing, as if he had ripped a piece of flesh. The black void outside shimmered for a moment, and then the glass fell, not in sharp shards, but in large, fluid pieces that landed on the floor with a soft, unnatural thud. He looked at the fragments of the broken window on the floor, each piece a shard of distorted reality. He saw his reflection in one of the pieces, the face of the scarred, haunted man staring back at him. The same face he had seen in the bathroom mirror so long ago. But this time, it was different. This time, the reflection was clear. It was a man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, a face etched with the lines of past trauma. He was an ugly, broken version of himself, but he was real. He knelt down, reaching for the shard of glass, wanting to hold on to his true face. And then he saw it. Behind his reflection, a new face emerged, not human at all, but a shape of pure absence, a smooth, featureless void that seemed to drink the light. The entity's true form was a faceless parasite, a shadow that wore a human face. Andrew's true face stared back at him from a broken shard of glass, and the entity's face was a void, a bottomless pit of darkness that pulsed with a malevolent light behind his. The void, the pulsing, faceless darkness reflected in the broken shard of glass, was not a hallucination. It was the entity's true face, a form of pure absence that consumed all light and all life. Andrew Mitchell stared at the horrifying image, his own scarred and tormented face superimposed over the malevolent nothingness. It was a perfect reflection of his situation, a man clinging to the last remnants of his humanity, a fragile shell being devoured from within by a parasitic emptiness. The realization was a cold, final blow that shattered his last illusions. The horror was not in the cabin, or in the blizzard, or even in Laura's empty smile. The horror was in the creature's very nature, a form of existence that fed on the memories, emotions, and identities of others. It was an ultimate predator, not of the body, but of the soul. He felt the house recoil, the roar from the walls subsiding into a low, mournful groan, as if a great, hungry beast was catching its breath. The temperature began to rise, the warmth of the fire returning as a soft, comforting presence, and the scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air once more. Laura, still standing in the middle of the room, her eyes now a placid, human blue, tilted her head, a soft, sympathetic expression on her face. The illusion was back in full force, polished and pristine, a perfect mask of a perfect life. But Andrew now saw it for what it was, a beautiful trap, a gilded cage designed to pacify him as he was slowly, meticulously consumed. His knowledge was a curse, a terrifying lucidity that made the prison all the more suffocating. He was not just trapped in a house, he was trapped inside a hungry god. He scrambled back, the broken glass forgotten, his eyes fixed on Laura's serene expression. The silence that now descended upon the cabin was not the heavy, oppressive quiet of before. It was a new kind of silence, the silence of a predator that knows its prey has given up. Andrew felt a deep, profound weariness settle into his bones, a surrender that was both physical and emotional. He had fought, he had found the truth, but what good was the truth in a world where it was meaningless? The entity had simply absorbed his resistance, his anger, his fear, and was now using those very emotions to fuel its own existence. The thumping from behind the walls was no longer his memory screaming, but the sound of his resistance, echoing in the belly of the beast. The last of his memories of Mary and David began to fade, not with a sudden pop, but with a slow, agonizing erosion. He could still see Mary's face, her beautiful, freckled smile, but the details of her life, the scent of her perfume, the sound of her laugh, the feeling of her hand in his, began to blur. The memories became thin, ethereal things, like smoke dissipating on a cold wind. The memory of David, his loyal friend, became a ghost, his face a fading photograph, his voice a distant murmur. The entities did not consume the memories wholesale. They siphoned them, taking only the emotional weight and leaving the empty husks behind. The memories were a battery, and he was being drained dry. He stumbled back to the armchair by the fire, the same one he had woken up in, and sank into its soft, plush embrace. The warmth was now a comforting blanket, a pleasant anesthesia numbing his senses. He looked at Laura, and her serene smile seemed to promise a final, absolute peace, an end to the struggle. He was a ghost, haunting his own life. The reality he had fought so hard to reclaim was gone, or rather it was being repurposed, its essence being used to nourish the entity that had stolen it. The perfect, manufactured life the house had created for him was now an elaborate tomb. He understood the final horrifying truth. The car accident, the loss of his memory, was all a part of the entity's plan. The story Laura had told him was not a lie. He had been in a car accident, but it was not the simple accident she had described. It was a ritual, a trap set for the lonely, the lost, the emotionally vulnerable. The entity had been stalking him, drawn to the quiet despair he felt in his real life, a life filled with unspoken sadness and loneliness. The house was not a thing of wood and stone. It was a consciousness, a cosmic parasite that created its own reality, a pocket dimension tailored to its prey's deepest desires. The perfect cabin, the loving wife, the eternal winter. It was all a projection, a beautifully crafted illusion designed to keep him complacent while the entity fed. He looked down at his hands, the hands with the work-worn calluses, a last, fragile connection to the life he had lost. The calluses were fading. The lines on his palms were smoothing out, becoming soft and unmarred. He was losing himself, not just his memories, but the physical imprints of his past, the very signs of his existence. He closed his eyes, a single, silent tear tracing a path down his cheek. It was a tear of loss, of defeat, of a final, terrible surrender. The fight was over. He had no more to give. He felt a gentle, soothing presence at his side, a soft hand on his shoulder. It was Laura, her voice a comforting murmur, speaking of a long life lived together, of cherished moments, of a perfect, unending love. He did not open his eyes. He did not have to. He had seen the void behind her face, and he now knew that the real terror was not in the fight, but in the surrender. He was no longer a person. He was a meal. The quiet warmth of the cabin settled over him, a gentle anesthesia for a mind that had been at war for so long. The struggle was over. Andrew felt the last remnants of his true memories, the precious artifacts of a life that was now lost, begin to slip through his fingers like grains of fine sand. He saw Mary's face for the last time, her beautiful, freckled smile, but the warmth of her presence was gone. Her hair, once a vibrant cascade of fiery red, faded into a dull, flat brown. The sparkle in her eyes vanished, leaving behind a vacant, two-dimensional image. He tried to hold on to the memory, to feel the love and the laughter one last time, but the feeling was gone, drained from the image by an unseen force. He looked at the phantom memory of David Harrison, his tall, robust figure, and the infectious smile. The image grew translucent, the solid form of his friend becoming a wavering ghost, the friendly light in his eyes dimming until it was just a faint glow in the darkness. He tried to remember the sound of David's voice, the tone and cadence of a lifetime of friendship, but there was only silence, a vast, echoing emptiness where the memory should have been. The memory of his other friend, Chris Jones, was the last to go. He tried to hold on to the last image of Chris, his loyal companion, his features so familiar and comforting, a silent anchor in his mind. But the image began to warp and shift, his dark hair becoming a formless blur, his well-groomed beard melting into a grotesque parody of itself. The friendly grin contorted into a silent scream, a final despairing cry before it, too, dissolved into nothingness. The memories were not being erased. They were being consumed. The emotions, the essence of the experience, were being siphoned away, leaving behind a sterile, meaningless husk. The void he had seen in the broken glass was not just a face. It was the ultimate consumer, a being that devoured the soul itself, leaving only the body behind. Andrew's final memory was of a shared joke with David, a long-ago moment of camaraderie and laughter. He could still remember the scene, the setting, the actions, but the humor was gone. The joy, the warmth, the genuine human connection, all of it had been leached from the memory, leaving behind a cold, empty shell of an event. He watched, an objective observer in his own mind, as the husk of the memory crumbled into dust. As his last real memories dissolved, his body began to change. He looked down at his hands again, and the worn calluses were completely gone, replaced by soft, unblemished skin. The jagged scar on his cheek, the one he had seen in the mirror, was smoothing out, the skin knitting back together as if the wound had never been. He was becoming the perfect version of himself, the unblemished, sanitized replica that the house had created. He felt his mind, once a tempestuous ocean of confusion and fear, become a placid, peaceful lake. The anger was gone. The paranoia was gone. The yearning for a life he had lost was gone. There was only a serene, vacant calm. The fight was over, and the house had won. The parasitic entity had successfully absorbed his pain, his sorrow, his love, and his defiance. It had consumed his humanity and replaced it with a hollow imitation of peace. He rose from the armchair, his movements no longer hesitant and paranoid, but smooth and fluid, a perfect, unthinking grace. He walked to the window, the one he had broken in a final, desperate act of defiance. The glass was whole again. The pane, a perfect sheet of transparent perfection, a spotless mirror reflecting the serene, flawless world of eternal winter outside. He looked at his reflection, the face of a man in his 40s, with calm blue eyes and graying temples. The scar was gone. The turmoil was gone. A soft, content smile was on his face. He was home. He had no memory of a different life, of a different wife, or of friends he had loved. There was only this place, this perfect cabin, and the perfect woman who loved him. He felt a soft hand on his shoulder, and he turned to look at Laura. Her face was serene, her smile a beautiful final embrace of his surrender. She was no longer a stranger. She was his wife. She spoke to him, and her words were no longer a venomous lie, but a soothing truth he had always known. The words were a soft, gentle melody about a long life filled with love. And Andrew listened, his heart full of a tranquil, empty peace. He was a perfect prisoner, and his mind was a perfect, beautiful void. The house had what it wanted. His last human emotion, a flicker of nostalgia for a life he couldn't remember, faded into nothingness, and a serene, vacant look settled upon his face. He was an empty shell, an elegant cage with a smile. The cycle was complete. The snow continued to fall in the perfectly contained, endless world outside, a silent, beautiful blanket on a perfect, empty grave. And with that, their story came to an end. But it leaves one last question for you. If you could live in a beautiful, perfect reality, would you trade your real memories for it? Share your answer and personal experiences in the comments below. See you in the next one.